Welcome to the set of lectures on the behavioral approach, which includes the social learning theory approach. So we're going to do 3 mini lectures for this chapter. Here's an outline of what we're going to cover for this unit. We're going to talk about an introduction to this approach, classical and operant conditioning. That'll be covered in the first lecture, the one I'm doing right now. Next, we're going to do a mini lecture on 2 important theorists from the social learning approach. And then the last mini lecture will cover behavior modification and a critique of this approach. So let's get started with just what is this approach all about? All right, so the behavioral approach to personality is basically the idea that we are who we are because of how we have responded in the past and how our environment has responded to us. So it's about the consequences of our decisions in the past. There are important theorists who started the behaviorist movement in psychology in general, and they've also all had things to say about how the behaviorist movement in psychology applies to personality. One of those important people is John Watson. We'll be talking about Watson in a minute with his famous little Albert study. But Watson basically was the person who started the behaviorist movement in psychology overall when he said that psychology had to study only observable behaviors. He said we had to get away from things like what Wilhelm Wundt was doing in Germany, what Sigmund Freud was doing in Vienna, where they were studying basically what goes on inside your mind. And he said, that's really not scientific. We can't study what goes on inside your mind. We can't measure that. We can only observe and measure actual behaviors. So that's why it's called the behaviorist movement in psychology. Watson also was a big proponent of what the ancient Greeks called tabula rasa, which translated into English means blank slate. Basically, this is the philosophy that Watson agreed with, which is that when we are born, we are totally sort of neutral. We don't have any inherited genetics or any temperament like we've talked about in the past. Watson believed that we are totally neutral and that every single part of who we are is because of what we experience. Now, we know that that's not true by today's standards. We know that we're affected by things like our prenatal hormone exposure, our genetics. But for Watson, he thought that every part of what we do, who we are, is because of the experiences that we have had since birth. So we start with Watson. Then we go to Thorndike. Thorndike was studying early behaviorism with animals. He was putting cats inside puzzle boxes and measuring how long it took for the cats to get out of the puzzle box. And basically what's important in terms of this class is that due to this research that he was doing with cats, he came up with what is now called Thorndike's law of effect. So basically what happened was the cats would be put inside this wooden box, and it had some levers, pulleys, and strings and stuff like that. And the cats had to do certain movements like press a lever with a paw and pull a string with their teeth. And the box would open up and they would be able to escape and get food. So what he found through this research is that each time the cat did the specific set of behaviors that was required to get out of the box, they would remember that, and they would remember the reward for that set of behaviors. And then the next time they were put in the box, they were more likely to do that exact same set of behaviors. So his Thorndike's law of effect basically says that if we're rewarded for certain behaviors, we're more likely to do them the next time around. And if we're punished for doing a certain set of behaviors, we're less likely to do those same behaviors the next time around. So Thorndike's law of effect was the complete foundation for what became operant conditioning later, which is all about how we do things to gain rewards or to avoid punishments. The last guy who's relevant to the history of behaviorism is B.F. Skinner. So B.F. Skinner is a really interesting character in terms of his influence on psychology, especially in the United States. Skinner was adamant that every single thing that we do is based on our past experience. He believed in a philosophical idea called determinism. Determinism is the idea that every event in the world is because of a previous event that occurred, and a series of events happen due to scientific principles, kind of like a domino effect, which means that when we make decisions, it's not actually free will. It's not an independent decision. It's based on everything that has happened up until that moment. So we think that we're making free, independent decisions. But really, the decisions that we make are always a function of what we have done in the past and how those events have been rewarded or punished. So how this relates to personality is that personality is gradually formed over our life and is constantly changing because of how each event in our life is rewarded or punished. So what are the consequences of each event in our life? So that's kind of the history of this approach to personality. It's very different from the approaches that we've talked about in the past. It's all about how external forces are shaping the people that we become. So in short, what this approach is saying is that our personality is based on how our behaviors led to consequences in the past, both good and bad, and that environmental training or sort of this reward and punishment, just like we would be animals being trained, that leads us to be the people that we are. So if you are extroverted, that is because in the past, when you acted in an extroverted manner, that led to some kind of reward, like you made a friend, you got a promotion at work, something like that. Same thing for any other trait. If you're narcissistic, that means that you must have been rewarded in the past for being narcissistic. So you can think about personality in terms of traits if you want, but the idea from this perspective is every trait that you have is because of how you were rewarded for that trait in the past. So importantly, in this perspective, personality is what you do. It's this behaviorist perspective that your personality is based on your actions, not the stuff that's going on inside your head. That doesn't actually matter. What matters is what you do. An example of this is you might have a friend who says that they're sorry for something, but if they keep doing it, well, they're not really sorry, are they, right? So it doesn't matter what they might think or what they might say, it's what do they actually do that matters. If they keep doing this thing that they know hurts your feelings, then that tells you something about their personality. It's our actions that matter, according to this perspective. Okay, so that said, this perspective is all about using the foundations of classical and operant conditioning. So you've probably heard about classical conditioning in a previous class. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the history of classical conditioning because I assume that you've had that in a class before this. If you need a review, you can see page 280 and 281 of the book. But remember that basically Pavlov trained dogs to salivate when they heard a noise. So classical conditioning is all about how we have an automatic response to one stimulus, like salivating when we have food in front of us, and that over time we transfer that automatic response to a different stimulus, like salivating when we hear a noise. That's what Pavlov did. So you transfer what was an automatic response to something that is no longer automatic. That becomes the conditioned response. Okay, just fun fact, by the way, everybody talks about Pavlov with bells. That is completely historically inaccurate. Pavlov never used a bell in his research. He actually used a metronome, a whistle, and a tuning fork. So all these jokes about, oh, Pavlov's name rings a bell, right? Those are kind of funny, but he never actually used a bell. So just so you know. Okay, so the whole idea is Pavlov trained his dogs to drool when they heard a noise. It was actually a metronome. And that response is unnatural. It only happened because of their previous responses where they saw that the noise was a cue that the food was about to arrive, right? So the point of this in terms of personality is, have our responses to stimuli been shaped by our past? When we see a certain person and we feel love, is that because in the past that person has been rewarding to us? If we see a certain person and we feel animosity or hatred, or we think, oh, they're kind of creepy, is that because in the past either that person or someone who reminds us of that person was bad and led to us having a negative experience, right? So it's all about how previous experiences shape our perceptions and our behavior, which has become our personality. Okay, I mentioned John Watson earlier. John Watson did a super famous and unethical study that is now called the Little Albert Study, which is all about how classical conditioning might affect our personality. So this was published in 1920. Watson and Rosalie Rayner, that was his student. This was when he was a professor at Johns Hopkins Teaching Hospital. He was a psychology professor at Johns Hopkins. And if you're familiar with the study, you already know a little bit of background, but just in case you're not familiar with it, and it is in the book, Watson, he was working at the hospital. He went to the hospital daycare, asked the people who worked at the daycare, who in this daycare, which baby is the happiest baby? It seems to never be upset. And they said, oh, Albert is always happy. So he said, great, I'm just going to borrow him. He did this without Albert's mother's permission. She was a nurse at the hospital. She did not know that the study was happening. He took Albert out of the daycare for several days over the course of several weeks, and he took Albert into his lab. Now, he tested Albert's emotional responses to a bunch of stimuli, and Albert was, just like the nurses said, always happy and laughing. One of the stimuli that Watson gave Albert was a white rat that had come from the lab, and Albert had a pleasant response to the rat. He laughed, he wanted to pet the rat, he was not afraid of the rat at all. Watson then wants to know, can we change the personality of Albert using classical conditioning? He wants to change Albert's personality from happy and laughing to being afraid. This is part of why the study is unethical. Okay, so in order to make Albert afraid of the rat, he's going to use classical conditioning to pair the rat with a loud noise that Albert hates. And he tests this by making the noise in front of Albert, and Albert immediately starts to cry and scream. And the noise is basically that Watson has a metal bar and a hammer, and he smacks the metal bar with the hammer, and it makes this really loud, like kind of like a tuning fork noise, and Albert cries. So the automatic response is the crying because of the noise. Watson wants to know, can he transfer that response of crying and fear to the rat? So he gives Albert the rat, no fear, he's petting the rat. Watson sneaks up behind him, smacks this metal bar right behind his head, and Albert startles and cries. And so they take the rat away, and they do this multiple times. Albert learns that the presence of the rat is a warning that this sound is about to occur, right? Just like for Pavlov's dogs, the noise that they heard was a warning that the food was about to appear. For Pavlov's dogs, that was a good thing. They wanted the food. For Albert, it's a bad thing. He knows that when this rat appears, I'm about to hear that noise. And so he starts to cry when he sees the rat, even though that was not his natural response. So Watson has now successfully taught Albert to be afraid of this rat. He sees the rat now, and he automatically starts to cry and lean away from the rat because he's afraid of that noise that he's associated with the rat. We see in the next phase of the study that Watson wants to know, okay, now that I've made you successfully afraid of this rat, has that changed your overall personality? And the way that he measures that is by seeing whether Albert is also afraid of similar things. So in the second picture here, you can see that they bring in a bunny. It's furry, it's small, it's kind of like a rodent, right? So even though Albert has never seen this bunny before, when they show Albert the bunny, he starts to cry. So this is called generalization. Generalization is the idea that even though we only trained you on this one specific stimulus with the rat, you are now having the same response in general to things that are sort of like the rat. So the bunny is close enough to the rat that you respond to the bunny the same way because you think small furry things in general might lead to the consequence of this noise that I don't like. Okay, so successfully now, Watson has taken a happy, wonderful baby and made it afraid of all white furry things. So this is one of the reasons, like I said, that the study was unethical. Another reason that the study was unethical is that Watson and Rayner were like doing it with each other in the lab, not allowed. Also, they were both married to other people, so adultery. And so Watson eventually got fired from the hospital for kidnapping Albert without his mother's permission and for doing it with Rayner in the lab. So Watson had originally planned to do a final step to this study where he was going to decondition Albert, but they never got the chance to do that. Okay, so Albert learned white rat equals scary noise. He's conditioned to have that association. So when he sees the white rat, he now has this response of fear, which he didn't have before the conditioning. He generalizes, which is that he shows fear response to other white furry things. Now, Watson originally planned to go through discrimination trials with little Albert. Discrimination trials would have been, we show Albert the rat multiple times, and every single time we hear the noise, right? As opposed to we show the rabbit multiple times and we never hear the noise. So Watson assumed that over multiple trials of rat always equals noise, rabbit never equals noise, that Albert would eventually learn to discriminate or distinguish between the two stimuli. So that was his original plan, but he got fired before you could actually go through with that phase of the experiment. Okay, so the point of this, in terms of personality, is that Albert had his personality changed through classical conditioning. Previously, he had been happy, laughing, he never was afraid of anything. Now, they had changed his personality to be afraid of any white, furry things. By the way, students always ask what happened to Albert after the study was over. Like, did he continue to go the rest of his life afraid of white, furry things? We don't exactly know the answer to that question because there were lots of babies in the daycare at that time who could have been Albert. We don't know if Albert was even the real name of the baby. There are two likely candidates for who little Albert was. One of them grew to old age and continued to have a fear of dogs the rest of his life. So it's possible that that was the little Albert in the study. But the one that's actually more likely is a baby who died when he was 6 of encephalitis. So probably little Albert unfortunately died as a young child. Okay, so how does this apply to adult personality? We can use classical conditioning to apply to adult personality if we assume that we act in ways that are similar to contexts we have been in the past, and that has taught us to respond in a way that leads to a reward. So we're kind of combining classical and operant conditioning here a little bit, but the idea is that we can expect things out of our environment. That's the classical conditioning part. And so we want to sort of shape our environment to lead us to good outcomes and to avoid bad outcomes. So for example, if early in life we learned that working hard in school led to positive consequences, then we will potentially have a personality that works hard in lots of contexts. So we might continue to be a hard worker in work contexts as well. We also hopefully learn to discriminate. So you might learn that working hard in some of your college classes pays off because your professor sort of notices that and rewards you for your hard work with a good grade. But other professors, maybe they don't really reward you for hard work. Maybe they reward you for kissing up to them, or their grading is so easy that you don't have to work hard, right? So you could start to make distinctions among your professors and know, I have to work hard in this class, I don't have to work hard in this class, right? So you will learn that in school, and then when you go to work, you might apply that same lesson to your bosses. I need to work hard for this boss, I need to kiss up to this boss, right? But the whole idea is that the choices that we make are based on how similar choices in the past led to certain consequences. That's what classical conditioning is all about. We also, of course, have operant conditioning, which I've mentioned a little bit already, but operant conditioning just makes it more explicit that we're avoiding punishment and seeking reward. So all of the behaviors that we do are hoping that we'll get a reward, and because we've been rewarded in the past, we're trying to avoid a punishment because we've been punished in the past. So an example of this is that a lot of stand-up comedians actually say that they maybe or they didn't really. And humor was a way that they got positive attention from a social context. So they were rewarded for that. They made that part of their personality. Okay, so that's sort of the foundation of this perspective. In the next mini lecture, we're going to talk about 2 specific theories that we can apply. See you then.